The vote was 91-1. My hand was the one. I sat in the observation gallery of the Grand Conclave and watched 47 species agree, without hesitation, that a human being should be put to death for telling the truth. The chamber smelled of ozone and something sweet that the Kelvari secreted when they were pleased. They were very pleased. The whole structure hummed around me, a crystalline megastructure the size of a small moon, orbiting a neutron star that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Neutral ground, they called it. I had never felt less safe in my life. His name was Elias Vance. He was a xenobiologist from New Nairobi, 44 years old, with sunburned forearms, and a habit of narrating everything he observed under his breath, as though the universe needed a transcript. He had been my colleague for 6 years before he became the most dangerous man in council space. He had gone into the sacred genome archives of the Kelvari without authorization. Not to steal, not to sabotage. He had gone in because he had found a pattern in 40 years of colonial extinction data. And the pattern pointed to one source, and he needed to know if he was right. He was right. The Kelvari had been seeding extinction events across developing civilizations for centuries. They used a biological agent, elegant and patient, disguised perfectly as a natural plague. They targeted species they classified as biologically aggressive, which was their polite term for any civilization that might one day challenge their position in the council hierarchy. The archives contained the full operational record, species selected, timelines approved, outcomes confirmed. 43 civilizations across 6 galactic sectors, reduced to fossil records and cautionary footnotes. Humanity's name was on the list, had been there for 40 years. Elias had published everything, every record, every coordinate, every internal communication. He sent it through an open scientific relay before the Kelvari had any idea what he had found. By the time they arrested him, the data was already distributed across 12 independent research networks. You cannot unpublish the truth. The Kelvari understood this, which was why they were not charging him with espionage. They were charging him with violation of the Sacred Archive Protocols, a capital offense under Kelvari law, which the Council had ratified as binding on all member species 30 years ago, 2 years before Earth joined. 2 years before Earth joined. We had never been asked whether we agreed. We had simply inherited the terms. I had spent 48 hours trying to stop the trial before it began. I filed 6 formal protests. I submitted 3 requests for independent legal review. I contacted every allied delegation I could reach and asked for their support. The Ventali ambassador, a methane brother named Surak with whom I had shared synthesized whiskey on more than one occasion, squeezed my arm with one of her secondary limbs and told me quietly that she was sorry, but her government could not afford to be seen opposing the Kelvari in open session. The Dresh Collective sent an automated acknowledgement. Everyone else sent nothing at all. The Kelvari prosecutor did not argue that Elias's findings were false. That detail has stayed with me ever since. He stood before the council, all 4 meters of iridescent chitin and calm authority, and he made no effort to dispute a single data point in the published record. He argued instead that the method of acquisition was illegal, that the sanctity of sovereign archives superseded the content of what those archives contained. That process was more important than truth, because without process, there was no order, and without order, the galaxy would collapse into the chaos that the Council had spent 3,000 years preventing. He said this with complete sincerity. That was the most alarming part. I was allowed a statement on Elias's behalf. I stood at the podium and I spoke for 20 minutes. I talked about the civilizations in the archive records. I named as many as I could from memory. I said that a legal system which protected the record of those actions, rather than the victims of them, was not a system of order. It was a system of concealment. I said that humanity had not joined the Council to participate in concealment. I said that the vote before them was not really about archive protocols. It was about whether truth had any standing in this chamber at all. 91 species voted that it did not. I pressed my hand against my console and registered humanity's dissent. The sound it made was a soft chime, almost pretty. A single note against a chorus of silence. Elias was held in a transparent cell 2 floors below the chamber. I went to see him immediately after the vote. The guards, a species called the Varathi who served as council security, let me through without hesitation. Witnesses were permitted. Witnesses were, I understood now, part of the ritual. He was sitting on the floor, with his back against the wall, and he was writing on a paper napkin with a stylus he had clearly talked a guard into, lending him. He was narrating quietly to himself, which meant he was working. I pressed my palm flat against the transparent barrier. He looked up, registered my expression, and nodded once with the calm of someone who had already finished grieving and moved on to the next task. He held the napkin up so I could read it. He had been making detailed anatomical notes about the Varathi guard's respiratory system. He had observed something unusual about the way the guard's secondary lung operated, and wanted to document it before the environment changed. Even then, even there, he could not stop being what he was. He pointed at me and mouthed two words very clearly. I read them without difficulty. I had 48 hours to figure out what to do with them. Tell them. I walked back to my quarters on the residential level of the conclave, and I sat down at my communications terminal, and I thought for a long time about what telling them actually meant. My official channels were monitored. Every transmission I sent through Council Relay was logged, reviewed, and subject to delay at the discretion of the Communications Committee, which was currently chaired by a Kelvari delegate. Anything I sent through official channels would arrive on Earth long after the execution was completed, stripped of anything the Council considered sensitive, which would likely mean stripped of everything that mattered. I thought about Siserac. I thought about what she had said to me 2 years ago, slightly warm from the whiskey, with the particular honesty that diplomatic figures allow themselves only in private. She had said that she respected humans because they were the only species she had encountered that treated urgency as a moral obligation. Every other species, she said, had learned over centuries to separate the feeling of urgency from the decision to act. Humans, she said, had never learned that separation. She had not said it as a compliment exactly, but it had not sounded like a criticism either. I went to find her. She was in the Ventali delegation suite, which smelled of methane and something faintly floral, and she looked at me when I came in with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and was not entirely sure they were glad about. I did not ask her to take a political position. I did not ask her government for anything. I asked her if the Ventali commercial relay network was still operating on its independent frequency, the one that ran outside council monitoring, because it had been established before the monitoring protocols were written, and the Kelvari had never gotten around to bringing it under oversight. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said yes, it was still operating. She asked me what I was going to send. I told her the truth. She considered it. She told me that if this went badly, her government would deny any knowledge of the relay arrangement. I said I understood. She said that she hoped the message reached the right people. I said I hoped so too. I went back to my terminal and I wrote the message. I did not write it in panic and I did not write it as a plea. I wrote it as a report, precise and complete. I described the trial, the charges, the vote count, the timeline. I attached Elias's published findings in their entirety, every page, every data point, including the section that contained humanity's name on the Kelvari's culling list. I described the execution schedule. I described what the Kelvari prosecutor had argued, and the fact that he had not disputed the data itself. Then I added one sentence at the end, not as an instruction and not as a request, just as a statement of fact for whoever was reading to do with as they chose. I wrote that Earth should know what kind of council it belonged to. I sent it through the Ventali relay. Then I sat in my quarters and listened to the conclave hum around me. This enormous, beautiful structure built by species older than human civilization, and I thought about Elias on the floor of his cell writing notes about a guard's respiratory system, and I thought about 43 civilizations that were gone, because something with iridescent chitin had decided they were too alive. 32 hours passed. Nothing came back. I began to prepare myself for the possibility that the message had been intercepted anyway, or that it had arrived and Earth's government was working through proper channels, which would take months, or that they were simply too far away to matter right now. Then the Kelvari ambassador himself requested a private meeting. His name was Kethavar, and he was the oldest serving diplomat in the council, which meant he had been practicing this specific kind of patience for longer than humanity had possessed space travel. He sat across from me in a small conference room, and he looked at me with compound eyes that caught the light in shifting patterns, and he made me an offer that he clearly believed was generous. Elias's sentence would be commuted to permanent exile. Humanity's name would be officially removed from the Kelvari operational list. In exchange, I would issue a formal statement declaring that Elias's findings were fabricated, produced through unauthorized manipulation of archive data, and that Earth's government fully repudiated them. I would do this publicly, on the record, in front of the full council. He said that this was the cleanest resolution available. He said that it protected everyone. I sat with that offer for 6 hours. I want to be honest about that. I sat with it for 6 full hours because it sounded, in the exhausted and frightened part of my mind that had not slept properly in 4 days, like a door that led somewhere survivable, Elias's life, humanity's safety, a way out of this room that didn't require watching someone die. I thought about what Elias had written on that napkin. Still working, still looking, still needing to understand the universe honestly, even in the last hours available to him. I sent Kethavar my answer in writing so there would be no ambiguity. 4 words. The findings are real. 2 hours later, with 8 hours remaining before the execution, a message arrived from Earth. Not from the diplomatic corps, not from the military command, from the Secretary General's personal terminal, routed through the Ventali relay, which meant she had already spoken to someone who had spoken to Cesarak, which meant there were conversations happening that I did not have full visibility into, which meant Earth was moving in ways I had not directed and could not predict. The message was 3 words, "We see you." I read it 4 times. Then I printed it and put it in my jacket pocket and went to sleep for 3 hours, because I had learned a long time ago that there was no useful thinking to be done in the last stage of exhaustion. Whatever was going to happen next would happen whether I was rested or not. I chose to be rested. The alarm woke me 2 hours before dawn of the galactic cycle. I dressed carefully. I put the printed message back in my pocket. I went downstairs to the place where Elias Vance was being held, because he was going to need someone to look at him like he mattered, and I was the only human in the building. The chamber they used was nothing like what I had imagined. I think I had expected something dramatic, something designed to feel like a statement. Instead, it was a clean, quiet room with soft lighting and air that was temperature-controlled to precisely comfortable. It looked like the kind of room where you might have a difficult meeting, not the kind of room where something permanent happened. I understood after a moment that this was intentional. The Kelvari had been doing this for a very long time, and they had learned that sterile normalcy was more effective than theater. Theater made people angry. Normalcy made them feel that resistance was irrational. There were 9 council representatives present as required witnesses. I was the 10th, the human representative, permitted and required to be there by the procedural rules Kethavar had cited with such warm courtesy when he notified me of the time and location. I found my seat in the witness section and I did not look at anyone around me. I looked at the center of the room. Elias was already there. He was standing at a small podium that had been placed in the center of the floor, which I had not been informed about. I learned afterward that he had requested it, and that the request had been granted because granting small requests to the condemned was another thing the Kelvari had learned over centuries. It made the process look dignified. It made opposition look petty. He had been allowed to clean up and change into a fresh set of clothes, dark pants, and a gray shirt, and someone had given him back his personal notebook, which he was holding against his chest. He looked at me when I came in. He nodded once. Then he placed the notebook on the podium, opened it to a page that was dense with small handwriting and diagrams, and he began to speak. He did not make a personal statement. He did not speak about himself, his life, his family, or what he was feeling. He delivered a scientific lecture. 40 minutes. Methodical, calm, covering in careful sequence the extinction patterns he had discovered, the biological signatures of the agent the Kelvari had used, the timeline of each confirmed event, the population models that showed what the affected civilizations might have become if the agent had not been introduced. He cited sources. He acknowledged uncertainties in his data where they existed. He noted the points at which further research would be needed. He spoke directly to me at several points, not emotionally. He would pause and say something like, "On page 17 you will find the secondary analysis," and then he would continue. He was giving me a guided summary of his complete findings, annotated, in real time, because he wanted to make certain I had everything I needed to continue the work after he could not. I took notes on everything. I did not stop writing once. The council representatives in the witness section shifted and murmured at various points. The Kelvari lead delegate, a different official from Kethavar, sat with complete stillness throughout. When Elias finished his lecture, the delegate rose and said in a flat voice that the record of remarks would be sealed under council security protocols and would not be reproduced or transmitted. Elias looked at him for a moment. Then he said pleasantly that the remarks had already been transmitted. The room went very quiet. He tapped his notebook. He explained, spent a portion of the previous night's permitted communication window converting the full text of his lecture into a compressed data packet, and a Ventali staff member whose name he declined to give had assisted in routing it through a commercial relay before this session began. The packet had been addressed to 40 research institutions across 11 species territories, marked for immediate open access publication upon receipt. The delegate told him that this action would be considered in the final record. Elias said that he understood. He closed his notebook and stepped back from the podium. He looked at me one more time, and his expression was not the expression of someone who needed comfort. It was the expression of someone who had finished a piece of work and was satisfied with it. He gave me a small, precise nod. I held his gaze and did not look away. Not once, not for a single moment of what followed. I will not describe the mechanics of what the Kelvari used, because Elias would have wanted me to focus on the data and not the drama, and because the details serve no purpose here. What I will say is that it was fast and that the room remained quiet, and that the soft lighting did not change, and that the temperature-controlled air remained precisely comfortable throughout. When it was over, I remained in my seat until everyone else had left. I sat in that clean, quiet room, and I breathed slowly, and I thought about 43 civilizations, and I thought about a man writing notes about a guard's respiratory system on a napkin, and I thought about what the word dignity really meant and who got to decide. The Kelvari lead delegate stopped beside my chair on his way out. He looked down at me with the patient certainty of something very old and very confident in its own permanence. He said that my species should understand this was how order was maintained. He said that humanity was young. He said that in time we would learn. I said nothing. I did not trust myself to say anything, and beyond that, I had nothing to say that would have landed the way I needed it to land. Some responses are not meant for the moment they are earned. Some responses require preparation. I went back to my quarters. I made a complete record of every observation from the morning, organized it against my existing notes, and then I opened a new transmission window. I did not send it through the Ventali relay. I sent it through official council channels, logged and documented, flagged for council communications records. I wanted this one witnessed. I transmitted, through official channels to Earth's Secretary General, a complete record of the session, including a certified account of Elias's final statement, my personal testimony of events witnessed, and a formal request that Earth's government review its obligations under council membership in light of the documented activities of the Kelvari, as established in the public record. Then I sent a second transmission, also through official channels, also logged. This one went directly to the council secretary's office. It was a formal notification that the human delegation considered the execution of Elias Vance to constitute a misapplication of council law, and that Earth reserved the right to seek independent legal review of the Kelvari archive, protocols under the terms of the species rights framework that the Council had itself ratified. I sent it knowing full well it would be assigned to a committee that would not convene for months. That was not the point. The point was the log entry. The point was that every step we took from here would have a recorded starting line. Then I waited. What happened next did not come from Earth's government. It did not come from any military command. It came from Earth's entire civilian broadcast network, which had received Elias's data packet through the Research Institution Relay and, in a decision made by editors and producers and ordinary people sitting in studios and offices around the planet, had chosen to treat it as what it was, the most important news story in human history. They broadcast it on every frequency the Council used, all of them, simultaneously in 47 languages, addressed directly and by name to every species in Council space, not a threat. Not a declaration of conflict, not a government statement carefully worded by diplomatic staff, just Elias's findings, clean and complete, with his name on them, transmitted by the civilization he had died telling the truth for. His last lecture, given in a quiet room to 9 indifferent witnesses and 1 human who refused to look away, went to the entire galaxy. The Kelvari lead delegate's calm, I heard later, was not visible in the first moments after the broadcasts began. 3 weeks after the execution, I was still at the conclave, because leaving felt like abandoning the work, and because Earth had asked me to stay. The Secretary General had sent me a message through official channels, long and detailed, the kind of message that takes hours to write. She said they needed eyes inside the chamber while the situation developed. She said that what I had done in sending that first transmission had started something, and that they wanted me present to watch what it became. What it became was extraordinary, and not in the way I had expected. There was no military response from Earth, no fleet movement, no ultimatum. I want to be clear about that because the absence of it is important to understanding what actually happened. Earth did not reach for weapons. Earth reached for something it had been quietly building for 30 years of Council membership, something the Kelvari had never properly evaluated as a threat because it did not look like one. Earth reached for relationships. The Venantali called an emergency session of their own governing council the day after the broadcasts. Sarek, in a communication she was careful to route officially so there would be a record, told me that the Kelvari's operational list contained 3 Ventali colony worlds that had experienced catastrophic biological failure events over the past century, events that had been ruled natural, events that the Ventali government had mourned and documented and never questioned because there had been nothing to question until now. The Dresch Collective, which had sent me an automated acknowledgement 3 weeks ago and said nothing else, released a statement through its consensus voice. the closest thing they had to a single spokesperson, declaring that 6 Dresch population centers matched the biological signatures in Elias's published data and requesting that an independent scientific body review the historical records. The Marathi Bloom minds, who communicated in color frequencies that required a translation apparatus, and who had always struck me as genuinely indifferent to galactic politics, sent a communication that took 3 hours to fully translate. When it was done, the translation read as a list of names, 41 of them, Bloom colonies that had gone silent over 400 years of Marathi recorded history. Below the list, a single question, rendered in the deep amber frequency the Marathi used for formal declarations. It asked whether the silence was natural. The answer was in the archive data. Everyone knew the answer now. The council fracturing did not look like what people picture when they imagine political collapse. There was no shouting in the chamber. There was no dramatic walkout, not yet. What happened was quieter and more permanent. Delegations that had previously aligned with the Kelvari on procedural votes began requesting extra time for internal consultation before committing to positions. Committee chairs who had previously operated with efficient confidence started finding reasons to table items for further review. The machinery of council order, which had run smoothly for 3,000 years on the assumption that the Kelvari's version of history was accurate, began to encounter friction at every point where that assumption needed to support weight. I found myself in a role I had not planned for and had no formal title describing. Species were coming to the human delegation suite to talk, not to negotiate, not to form a bloc, not to coordinate a political strategy, just to talk, to sit across from me and say things that they could not say in any official capacity, because the official capacity required them to have a position, and they were not ready to have a position yet. They needed to think out loud in front of someone who was not going to use what they said against. I listened. I took notes, which everyone knew I was doing and no one objected to, because the taking of notes was now associated in every delegation's mind with the work Elias had done, and there was a kind of protection in being documented by someone who had demonstrated that they documented things accurately. A Varathi security captain came to see me one afternoon. The Varathi served the council as a whole and were not supposed to have political affiliations. He sat in the small chair across from my desk and he told me, in a very flat voice, that 3 members of his species had been stationed at a colony world 60 years ago that appeared on the Kelvari's operational list. He said they had died in the event. He said they had been honored as victims of a natural disaster. He did not say anything else. He sat for a moment and then he stood and left. I wrote it down. The emergency council session called to address what the official agenda described, as the information crisis was held 18 days after the execution. I was given the floor. I had prepared carefully, not in anger, not in grief, though both were present and had been present every morning when I woke up. I had prepared the way Elias would have prepared, with data, with structure, with complete attention to the difference between what was documented and what was assumed. I presented 3 formal demands on behalf of Earth. The first was a full independent audit of Kelvari biological research operations covering the past 500 years, conducted by a scientific body with no existing council affiliations. The second was the establishment of a reparations framework for species affected by confirmed events, with affected species participating directly in the design of that framework. The third was a restructuring of council judicial procedures to require a 2/3 supermajority plus independent review before any capital sentence could be carried out against a member species citizen. I did not call for the Kelvari to be expelled. I did not call for punishment. I presented the 3 demands, and I said that they represented the minimum necessary steps to establish that the council was capable of governing itself with integrity, and that without them, Earth would need to reconsider the terms of its membership. The Kelvari delegates sat in complete stillness through the entire presentation. When I finished, their senior delegate rose and said, in the formal cadence of a prepared statement, that the Kelvari considered the demands an act of political aggression driven by a young species, emotional response to a legal process that had been conducted properly under applicable law. Then all 40 of their delegates stood and walked out of the chamber simultaneously. It was a stunning piece of theater. The Kelvari had clearly prepared it, and it was clearly intended to demonstrate that they considered the council unable to proceed without them, that their departure would create a paralysis that would bring other species back into line through the simple force of institutional dependence. What they had not accounted for, and what I had been careful not to signal in any of my official communications, was that Earth had not been idle during the 3 weeks since the execution. Our deep space survey teams, the quiet ones, the ones that had been operating on extended missions for years, and whose movements were logged in a council database that the Kelvari did not prioritize monitoring because survey teams were not considered a security concern, had spent those 3 weeks doing something very specific. They had mapped every Kelvari installation in council space, every colony world, every research station, every fleet depot and supply hub, not to target them, not to threaten them, to know them completely, with the obsessive thoroughness that humans brought to things when they decided that knowing something was important. The maps were detailed, accurate, and stored in 3 separate archival systems with automatic redundancy. Protocols because Elias had taught us, at the cost of everything, that the only thing more important than finding the truth was making absolutely certain the truth could not be lost. When the Kelvari High Admiral contacted Earth directly 6 days after the Council walkout, bypassing the Council entirely, speaking to the Secretary General through a private channel that he believed was secure, and that was, in fact, being routed through equipment that Earth's communications team had politely and thoroughly documented the specifications of during a technical cooperation visit 2 years ago, he indicated that he wished to discuss a resolution. The Secretary General sent him back one document, not a counterproposal, not a list of demands, not a treaty draft. She sent him Elias Vance's published findings, formally resubmitted as evidence in the public record of the Council's Interstellar Court of Record, with a cover note stating that Earth considered the documentation complete and the matter of record, and that any resolution framework would need to begin from that established factual baseline. No threats, no fleet positions, just the data. The same data that had started all of this, formally lodged in every legal archive that mattered, permanent and retrievable by anyone who looked. I heard about this through an official notification from the Secretary General's office, and I sat with it for a long time before I understood completely what had just happened. The Kelvari had tried to negotiate their way around the facts. Earth had responded by making the facts more permanent. The message that came for me personally arrived the following morning. Earth was recalling me, but not in the way a recall usually works. There was no suggestion of failure, no reassignment, no quiet removal from a situation that had become uncomfortable. The Secretary General wanted me to come home to testify before a joint session of every democratic government on the planet, in a session that would be live-streamed across all of human space, open to every citizen who wanted to watch. She said, Earth had decisions to make about its future in the Council, and that those decisions belonged to the people, and that the people needed to hear from someone who had been in the room. She said she wanted the Council to watch humanity decide, out loud, together, what kind of species it was going to be. I packed my things. I said goodbye to Cesarik, who held my hand in 2 of her secondary limbs for a long moment and did not say anything, which from a Ventali was the equivalent of a long speech. I made a full copy of every note I had taken since arriving at the conclave and stored it in 4 separate systems with the redundancy protocols that were becoming standard practice for humans involved in anything that mattered. I left the Grand Conclave for the last time through the main departure hall. Past delegations who watched me go with expressions I had learned to read over years of working in that building. Some were calculating, some were curious, a few, the ones from the species whose colony worlds appeared in Elias's data, looked at me with something that I can only describe as the particular relief of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time, and has finally been seen carrying it. I carried that with me all the way back to Earth. The gravity hit me the moment the transport cleared atmosphere. Not metaphorically, physically. My body, which had spent weeks in the standard council-regulated gravity of the conclave, remembered what home felt like and made a specific, involuntary adjustment, a settling of weight into joints and muscles that had been compensating for something they had not consciously noticed was missing. I stood at the viewport and watched the coast of West Africa resolve itself out of cloud cover, and I breathed slowly, and I let the weight of the planet hold me for a moment before anything else began. The testimony took 4 days. I was not the only witness. There were diplomatic historians, xenobiologists who had reviewed Elias's data independently, representatives of human communities on colony worlds who wanted the Council to understand that the risk described in the Kelvari's operational list was not an abstraction to the people who lived on those worlds. There were legal scholars debating the terms of Council membership and what obligations those terms did and did not carry. It was enormous and complex and exhausting and real, the way things are real when a civilization is thinking seriously about something that matters. I testified on the 3rd day, 6 hours in the morning session and 3 in the afternoon, with a break for food that I barely tasted. I described everything: the trial, the vote, the cell, the napkin with the notes about the guard's respiratory system. I described the offer Kethavar had made me and the 6 hours I had spent sitting with it. I described the execution chamber, the clean, quiet room, the comfortable temperature. I described Elias at the podium, methodical and calm, citing sources and acknowledging uncertainties, giving the universe its transcript one last time. I did not present it dramatically. I presented it the way he would have wanted it presented, with attention to accuracy, and a clear separation between what I had observed directly and what I had inferred. The chamber was very quiet through most of it. Not the silence of indifference. The silence of people paying close attention to something that was costing them something to hear. During the afternoon session, the Joint Committee opened the floor to public questions submitted through the national relay. There were thousands of them. The moderators had selected a representative sample. Most were the questions I had expected. What should Earth do next? Whether we should stay in the Council or leave. Whether the military should be placed on alert. Whether the documentation had been verified by independent parties. Good questions, serious questions. The questions a civilization asks when it is trying to figure out how to act responsibly in a situation it did not choose. The last question of the session came from a school in Osaka. The committee chair read it in a slightly surprised tone, as though it had made it through the selection process by accident, and she was not entirely sure it should be there. But she read it. The question was from a 12-year-old student named Oliver. He asked whether it had been worth it. Elias dying, he said. Did it change anything? The committee chair looked at me and asked if I wanted to take it. I sat with it for a while. The chamber waited. I said that Elias had not made the decision he made because he calculated it would change things. He had not run a probability analysis on outcomes before deciding to publish what he found. He had published it because he was a scientist and the data was real, and he was constitutionally unable to look at real data and pretend it did not exist. He had not died for a strategy. He had died because he was exactly what he was, without compromise all the way to the end. I said that the change that had followed, the council fracturing, the species coming forward, the Kelvari isolated and documented and no longer operating from the assumption of permanent concealment, that had not been Elias's work. That was ours. That was the work of everyone who had received his data and decided to take it seriously. Everyone who had come to the human delegation suite to sit in a chair and say things that needed to be said. Everyone who had broadcast his lecture to the galaxy because they recognized it for what it was. The change was never his to make alone. It was the thing we built from what he left us. And that part, I said, was nowhere near finished. Oliver's question was the last one of the session. The formal council response came 3 days after I finished testifying. The Kelvari were suspended from council proceedings, pending the establishment of an independent investigative tribunal. The tribunal was to be composed of representatives from 7 species, none of them holding current council committee positions, operating under a new evidentiary framework based on, and this was the language in the official document, open access verified documentation. Someone in the drafting committee had a sense of the specific kind of irony that does its work quietly. 7 species formally requested that Earth provide the presiding legal framework for the tribunal proceedings. Not the Kelvari's framework, not the Council's existing procedural system. Earth's, the framework that a young species had been building for 30 years without anyone paying close attention, because it was built on the assumption that facts were permanent and that process existed to serve truth rather than the other way. Around as I was in my apartment in Accra when the notification came through, it was raining. The kind of rain that comes in from the ocean and makes everything smell like the beginning of something. I had been trying to sleep and mostly failing, which was a habit I had developed sometime around the trial and had not yet managed to break. I read the notification twice. Then I sat down at my desk and opened a new file on my terminal. I thought about what to name it. I thought about Elias on the floor of his cell, narrating quietly to himself, documenting what he could for as long as he could, because the universe needed a transcript and someone had to provide it. I named the file the Vance Documentation Standards, Draft 1. I set a cup of tea beside the terminal, turned up the lamp against the rain and began to write. The galaxy was very large. There was a great deal of work to do. I was, above all things, still here to do it. Outside, the rain continued, and across 11 species territories and 6 galactic sectors, 43 civilizations that had been reduced to footnotes had their names entered into a new kind of record, one that was designed to stay open, to stay accurate, and to stay impossible to seal away in any archive ever again. Elias would have found the taxonomy of the filing system worth narrating. I made a note to get the taxonomy right.